أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فوض أمري إلى الله إن الله بصير بالعباد. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل ونعم المولى ونعم النصير. والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل. وعلى أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. اللهم صل. وقل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتاب الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لن تنالوا البر حتى تنفقوا مما تحبون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. My respected elders, brothers and sisters in Iman, wherever you may be, Salamun alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. On our journey of spirituality, one of the elements that we've discussed and highlighted, which we'll expand upon today, is this idea that upon this journey and along this journey, on this way, there will be challenges, there will be difficulties, there will be adversities. The same way there have been since time immemorial, since the beginning of time. From the stories of the prophets and the beginning of time in mankind throughout modern era and modern society, there will be moments in time where you and I are challenged, where you and I will go through difficulty, where you and I will go through adversity. And an interesting time and an interesting environment related to this is the current circumstance and the current environment that we're going through right now. That is the environment of COVID-19, the environment of coronavirus. And keeping all of these things in mind, I want you to keep the question at the back of your mind being the following: why do we get challenges? Why do we get adversity? Why do we get problems in our lives? Keep this question in the back of your mind as we proceed, inshallah. And so the element of the question that emerges is, first of all, why do these challenges and problems emerge? Number two, when they do emerge, what is it that I'm to do? Do I think this is for example, a punishment from God? Is this a test from God? Is this going to just happen just as it is? What is that dialogue that's happening in my head? What is that with respect to my relationship to my creator? And then finally, what is it that I can do? What are some solutions to these challenges that I face? I want to discuss some of these levels and go deeper on this question of evil and this question of problems and this question of suffering that we face. Why? Because as human beings, one of the biggest questions that people of faith, people of religion, whether they be Jewish, whether they be Christian, whether they be Muslim, whether they be any major religion on the planet, one of the main questions that has led people to leave Christianity, leave Judaism, lead, for example, Islam even, is the question of why does suffering exist? The question of why does evil exist? Why do problems exist in my life? And the rationale behind this question that emerges is those who ask this question, and it's a natural question. The question that emerges, well, God is all good. God is everything about God is essence. He is all good. He's omnibenevolent. And God is all knowing. He knows everything. Allah has all knowledge. And then on top of that, God has all power. He's omnipotent. He has all the power. So God is good. God has all of the knowledge, and God has all of the power to do whatever he wishes and whatever he pleases. Well, if that's the case with respect to God, that he has all of the power, he has all of the knowledge, he has all of the goodness, then how is it that I see, for example, in my world suffering? How do I see, for example, in my world, a child who's 4 years old being diagnosed or 5 years old being diagnosed with cancer? And they're and that child's parents having to look after this child and not know what to do. Why do I see, for example, children in Africa starving? Why do I see children in India starving? Why do I see children in my own backyard starving, for example? Why do we see this? Why does this happen? Surely a God who's all good, who's all knowing, who's all powerful, he would be able to solve this problem so it doesn't exist. And therefore, not being able to answer this question, rather, not being able to reconcile these three dimensions of an all good God, an all knowing God, and an all powerful God who has the ability to change things, Many people have left the fold of religion and said that I can't solve this problem, therefore God doesn't exist, or at least a good God doesn't exist, and they leave the fold. And many of the people in our communities, young and old alike, are not immune to having these thoughts, are not immune to having these questions. They have the same questions. And it's fair and fine to have these questions. They arise naturally many a times. But this goes back to the worldview that we look at the world from and the lens we look at the world from. Ask the questions, no problem at all. In fact, it's encouraged within our viewpoint of the school of the Ahlul Bayt. But at the same time, it's very important to seek out the answers and not say, oh, the answer is not available to me on a silver platter and I don't get it, therefore it doesn't exist, therefore I leave religion. You should try to strive to find these answers because the answers are there. Therefore, in the brief moments that we have together, I want to look at and I want to highlight a few dimensions. I want to look at comparative religion and look at, for example, the story of Nabi Job or Prophet Job as it is told in the Bible, for example, as well as then I want to look at what is that narrative within the Bible with respect to Nabi Ayyub alayhi salam, who we call in the Quran. Then I want to look at the Quranic perspective with respect to Nabi Ayyub alayhi salam. And then I want to look at what are some solutions that we can derive from this story that is told in the Bible as well as the Quran, so that you and I can derive benefit in our lives, to implement this in our lives, so that we can become better followers of Islam, better people of faith, and ultimately better citizens of society, inshallah. This is our schedule for the evening, inshallah. With respect to point number one, what is the story of Ayyub alayhi salam, and how can Ayyub alayhi salam help us to try to understand this question of why is it that there is suffering in the world, but more importantly, why is God just, for example, is God wise? These are the two main pillars that the story of Ayyub alayhi salam, Nabi Job or Prophet Job in the Bible looks at, as well as in the Quran, for example, highlights to this are made. With respect to who was this person, what is the story within the Bible, we'll first look at that, then we'll come to the Islamic perspective, and then look at what are the solutions we can derive. Having said that, from the Bible's perspective, there are 3 books in the Bible that you will find. For our brothers in Christianity and even Judaism, you will find 3 particular books which are called the wisdom literature. The first is Proverbs. This is the first element. The second book is called Ecclesiastes. And then the third is called Job, the book of Job. And each of these is supposed to impart wisdom on human beings. Now, keep all of these points in mind because they'll become very valuable as the conversation progresses, as we go further in our conversation. The first book, the Proverbs book, looks at the world and looks at a God who is wise and just and shows the fairness, the justice, the wisdom of God Almighty, and shows God is good and rewards justice, rewards fairness, rewards all of those elements. And it makes it clear that God is wise and just. The next book that comes forward, Ecclesiastes, comes forward and begins to raise questions on some of these things and says, well, if God is good and if God is wise and if God is just, then how is it that people suffer? How is it that people go through difficult times? How is it that people have to deal with difficult situations? How is it that someone may lose their wealth? How is it that someone may lose their family? How is it that someone may lose their health? How is it that a child suffers, for example, the cancer example that I gave earlier? So this is the second book of the wisdom literature in Christianity, of this idea of Ecclesiastes, who said that actually the matter is like smoke. And you'll remember Surah Dukhan in the Quran al-Majid wal Furqan al-Hamid, which we'll be reciting in the nights of Layal al-Qadr. And he says that, for example, that this solution or this matter referring to God being all wise and God being all just is more like smoke, that it's not so clear about it being good or bad and whether he's wise and just in reality. I say this very importantly because look, we are imparting on some of the most spiritual nights of our lives in the next few days of the year, and in general, these may be for our life. That is Layali al-Qadr, the nights of Qadr. And this is the time to develop our spirituality, to develop a connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if I have resentment, if I have doubts with my Lord, if I have resentment towards my Lord, if I feel even animosity towards my Lord for the difficulties that I have in my life, how am I to build that relationship? The first step is perhaps to have a conversation with Allah and think about things in a different way. Is it really a test? Is it really a trial? Is it really punishment? The jury is still out on that matter. So the second book in Christian literature I mentioned refers to and brings up the question, well, if God is wise and just, how is that the case? The first one, Proverbs, says God is wise and just. That's the summary. The second one says, well, how is it that God is wise and just if there's suffering in the world? People are dying, people are losing wealth, people are losing their families. Then the third book, which is called the book of Job in the Bible, or who we would call Ayub alayhi salam, this book emerges and it tries to answer this question with respect to, is God all wise and is God all just? So what happens? The story begins in a place called Uz, which is outside of what is the Middle East or modern day Palestine, Israel region. It's outside of that region. It's away from that. It's called Uz. And on top of that, many of the people who are mentioned are non-Israelites, as the Bible narrates, and are people, the time and space is being not as focused or emphasized in the biblical narration of the story. And the people who have commentated on this have argued the reason for this is because God didn't want the time and space to matter, to say that this is a timeless narration, that this will help you in all of times, whether it's for example, London in 2020, or for example, in Palestine in 2000 years ago. And so all of this culminates with a situation where God first has a conversation. We're first shown Job, Nabi Ayub, and we're shown that he has a family, he has wealth, he has a lot of property. That is, for example, he has sheep and he has agriculture and he has farms and he has a beautiful family. And at the same time, going forward, he has everything that anyone would want from in life. This is the first element. Then there is a scene, the next scene which has come forward is that we are shown God in the Bible, and he is having a conversation with his angels. And when he's having a conversation with the angels, he's saying, look at my servant Job, who is doing everything and praising me at every moment, and he's doing everything right, so to speak. And the next level, a character emerges by the name of Satan. Satan, which sounds very similar to our word shaitan, Satan comes forward, and Satan literally means one who accuses or one who opposes. And Satan in the Bible comes forward and says to God that this servant of yours by the name of Job, he's somebody who is praising you. He's someone who is worshiping you. Yes, but it's only because you've given him all of these gifts. You've given him wealth. You've given him farms. You've given him land. You've given him animals. That's why. Number two, you've given him a beautiful family, a wife, a children. He has the picture perfect marriage. He has everything picture perfect in his life. Number three, he has the best of health. He has no problems on these fronts. Everything that somebody could want for in life is taken care of for him. He has wealth, he has health, he has family, whatever you want, he has it. So what are you saying? So Satan comes forward and says, I am saying that if you remove these gifts, if you remove these belongings, if you remove these things from the life of Job, he will no longer be thankful to you. He will no longer be gracious to you. He will no longer be appreciative of your grace. At that point in time in the Bible, the narration goes that God gives Satan the ability to afflict harm onto Job. And it's a very intense harm. What begins to happen at that moment in time is Satan goes and he, for example, is able to first remove the wealth of Job. For example, the farming, the animals, all of those things, all the wealth that existed is removed, number one. Number two, at the second level, Job is still praising God at this point in time. The next level, there's a removal of the family, the loved ones, the children, they're all taken away. Even in the Bible narrative, the wife turns away and begins to accuse and begins to not be the best towards Job. The third level, his health, leprosy, his illness afflicts him at this point in time. And it becomes a very difficult situation. Yet, he's praising God outwardly. But then after this situation scenario emerges where three friends emerge into the life of Job in the Bible's narration. Three people emerge. And this is the bulk of what's going on in the Bible. So there's a prologue at the beginning, an epilogue at the end, and the majority of the conversation is poetry that is in Hebrew poetry. Keep all of this in mind because it will relate to the Islamic narrative and our relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what happens at this point in time is when everyone abandons, when the wealth goes, when the health goes, when the family is gone, Job is alone. And then three of his friends emerge, who are noted in the Bible to be non-Israelites. When these three friends emerge, they begin to essentially have a conversation with Job, and they begin to try to rationalize what has happened to him. That he's someone who had a picture perfect life. He had a life where he had wealth, he had family, he had his health, he had everything. And yet everything was seemingly in an instant removed and taken away from him. At this point, Job has a conversation with his friends. His friends begin to say that, well, God is all good, God is all just, God is all wise. Therefore, and you are suffering, and therefore, if you are suffering, and God is all good and all wise and all just, and you happen to be suffering, and God's not unjust, and God is not unwise, that means that the third level, you must have done something wrong in order to be suffering. You must have done something wrong, and that is why you are suffering. So they began to blame him. They began to come forward and say that you must have done something wrong. So let's think about this, Job. What did you do? Did you neglect God? Were you unfair to God? Did you blame God? What did you do to God? Were you doing something wrong? And Job begins to respond and say, no, I didn't do anything. And he begins to justify himself, and he begins to protect himself, and he begins to advocate on his behalf. And yet they're not convinced, because the conclusion that Job has come to and the conclusion that his friends have come to is different. The conclusion that his friends have come to is that God is all wise and all just, therefore, and at the same time, Job is suffering, and because Job is suffering, that means that he must have done something wrong, because God is not unjust and not unwise. Whereas the conclusion that Job has derived is that I have not done anything wrong, and at the same time, God is operating in a place where I'm going through suffering. Now, this is a distinction between the Islamic narrative and the Christian narrative, or the Judeo-Christian narrative, for example. That at this point, we believe it's very clear that Ayyub alayhi salam as a prophet is someone who's infallible, would not accuse Allah, has a strong relationship with Allah, all of these things. In the Bible, the conclusion that Ayyub alayhi salam derives is either one of two things. Either God is not just and wise in totality, or that God may be just and wise in totality, but he does not use his justice and wisdom in totality to operate the world. Meaning, our world may not operate under justice and wisdom of God in comprehensiveness. Notice this point, it's very important. It's a distinction. This is a difference that we have in the Islamic narrative versus the Christian narrative. Because in the Christian narrative and the Judeo-Christian narrative, Ayyub alayhi salam, or Job, is more of somebody who is a person. Whereas from our perspective, a prophet is a guide and is above these things. Nonetheless, this conversation ensues, and so the friends are not convinced. Then the Bible moves to another situation where Ayyub alayhi salam is now having, or Job is having, a conversation with God. And when he's having a conversation with God at this point in time, he begins to blame God, and we begin to hear the internal voice, the internal thoughts of Ayyub, not the outward praise that he was saying. And he begins to say things to the effect of, curse be on the day that I was born, that this affliction had I not been born. And he begins to blame God. And so this person who outwardly was very happy at one moment in time is now becoming very human in the biblical narration. He's beginning to say, why was I born? Why did God do this to me? Why did I have to suffer? Why did I have to lose my wealth? Why did I have to lose my family? Why did I have to lose my health? Why did I have to lose everything? I didn't do anything wrong. You're unfair. You're unjust. You're unreasonable, referring to God. And so he demands that God come down himself, that God comes down and explains himself. At that point in time, we're flashed to a friend, another friend, a fourth friend of Ayyub or Job. And this friend says, maybe it's possible that God is just and God is all wise, but at the same time, you may not be seeing everything. You may not see the whole picture. And he begins to say that maybe something between what your friends are saying and what you're saying, Job, there's a middle ground. That maybe God is all just, maybe God is, but at the same time, you may not see the whole picture. And maybe this is not punishment for you. Maybe you didn't do anything wrong. Maybe this isn't punishment, but maybe this is something else. Maybe God is preparing you for another time. Maybe he's giving you a test, not because you did something wrong in the past, not because you were erred in the past, no, but maybe something's about to happen to you in the future that may help you. And so this is not a test, rather, this is something that you need to grow to get to a better place. At that point in time, this is the fourth friend. Then when Ayub or Job begins to say to God, I want you to explain yourself, in the Bible, we're told Job or Ayub comes down God comes down himself in the form of a cloud. Of course, we would not accept that God could be in any form, whether human or nature form, because God cannot be limited. God is eternal and God is infinite. Therefore, in the biblical narrative, he comes down as a cloud and he begins to explain himself. He first takes, and keeping this in mind as we progress in this, because you and I go through problems in our own lives. And how do we think about these problems? How do we think about our challenges that we go through? Do we begin to blame God, or do we think about things in a different perspective? So in the Bible, God comes to Job or Ayub alayhi salam in the form of a cloud. And he begins to take him on a journey. And he takes him on this journey and he begins to show him all of creation. God begins to show Job all of creation. He begins to show him, for example, the seas and he goes to the mountaintop and shows him the goats and the mountain sheep and all of these things. And he shows him the birth of these animals, their offspring, and he shows him all of the depths of society and all of the depths of creation and all of the depths of nature, and he begins to show all the different intricacies and all the webs of creation and life. And Job is witnessing this and watching this and seeing all of this. And at that point in time, God comes forward and explains, do you see how intricate everything is? Do you see how deep everything is? Do you notice how many networks are at effect? How many different things are moving at once? And at that point in time, God says, according to the Bible, to Job, that I invite you to run this universe, run the world for one day. Would you be able to navigate everything? Would you be able to deal with everything? Would you be able to run this world? And Job is not able to, and he's not interested in that. That's not something that is of his keen liking. At that point in time, then the Bible says that God shows Job two creations of him. One's a behemoth, another is another creation. Some have argued that one is one type of creation and the other, and they're two beasts. And these two beasts, they are not the nicest ones. It would be like us looking at a documentary on National Geographic, for example, and seeing two beasts in the savannah. Think about a lion and a tiger, for example, fighting one another, or something like this. These two mammoth creations, or a crocodile and a hippopotamus, as some people believe these are the two creatures, or the prehistoric versions of them. They begin to fight. Well, are they bad? Are they good? Are they just neutral? What are they? They're acting on instinct, for example. But when I see from the lens of my view, and I see, for example, a lion and a tiger fighting, for example, and one kills the other, does that mean it's bad? That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at this perhaps is to come forward and say, well, hold on, maybe that's just nature. That's how biologists look at the world. And they say, maybe that's just instinct. And maybe there's a greater good in this. Maybe when one of them dies, for example, let's say the tiger kills the lion. And when the lion dies, for example, the tiger is able to eat. And then the tiger takes whatever it's able to take. And then whatever's left, for example, the ants begin to eat, the insects begin to eat, and other creatures begin to eat. And maybe that's a natural part of the world. How do you know this is good? How do you know this is bad? These questions emerge. And so at that point in time, a clear verdict on this is not given. But what God seems to be saying to Job or Ayub is that this whole puzzle is much more complicated than you can think, than you can rationalize, than you can actually understand. And then the Bible moves to the situation where God gives back to Job everything he had. In fact, he doubles it. He gives him more than what he had. He gives him his property and his wealth back in double fold. He gives him back his family more than before. He gives him back his health more than before. But the question that emerges here is this a reward? Is this good? Because look, if you analyze it, God said that those things that happened weren't punishment. You losing your health, you losing your wealth, you losing things were not a punishment. Well, does that mean that getting something in your life, getting these things double and more than before, does that mean that this is all good? Does that mean that this is all a benefit? Well, no, not necessarily. And so what the conclusion that the Bible gets to is that actually it's that Job begins to live, or Ayub begins to live a life where in the good times and in the bad, in the positive and in the negative, he begins to trust divine wisdom.
he begins to trust the wisdom of God. And as you can see, this was something that was personified in the lives of the Ahlul Bayt more than anything else. That is, in the life of Rasulullah, in the life of Amir al-Mu'mineen, in the life of Imam Hassan, alayhi salam, Imam al-Hussein, all the Imams all the way down the line, to the extent of Lady Khadija, Fatimah al-Zahra salamullahi alayha, and Lady Zainab salamullahi alayha, they had this trait that they encouraged us to adopt as well in our lives, to be thankful and grateful and have trust in God Almighty in the good times as well as in the bad times. This is what enabled Lady Zainab salamullahi alayha after Karbala, after Kufa in Sham, to look at Yazid and respond to him with such courage, with such audacity, with such charisma when he asked that what has Allah done to you and your family? He has rejected you, he has humiliated you, he has destroyed you. And she looks back and says, Ma ra'aytu illa jamila. I saw nothing but beauty. That she still had that thankfulness, that gratefulness, that gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we come to our communities, for example, how many brothers and how many sisters have gone through trials and tribulations? I mean, I just look around where Allah has given us the benefit and the ability to be able to travel and meet people and have conversations with people. People are hurting. People are going through difficult times. I know a brother from our community who suffered from visual impairment, for example. He was physically unable to see. On top of this, an environment occurred where at a young age he lost his brother. He loses his young brother, who's the breadwinner for the house, for example. And he leaves that life. If that wasn't tough enough, this person may be thinking, it would be natural for this person to begin to think, well, I have this, I can't see. On top of that, I lose my brother, who's the closest thing to me. And then on top of that, not too long ago, he loses his father, not too long after that. Then he loses his mother, and he's left by himself. Now, somebody may come forward and say that person has every right to blame God, that person has every right to leave religion. Somebody may say that person has every right to, for example, fall into depression. But this person didn't necessarily do that. This person came forward and said, well, I am in control of my destiny. And they found inspiration to take themselves and make themselves a greater person, to work harder, to for example, develop themselves. It all depends on the perspective with which you look at life. I know of, for example, families where there's suffering, tremendous suffering going on. Where, for example, a father may be abusive towards his wife, towards their mother. And a daughter doesn't know how to deal with this situation. She doesn't know what to do because she's young. She doesn't know how to solve this problem. It's her father, but the father is being abusive towards the mother. How does a child go through that? How does a daughter go through that? Or even a son, for example. How does anyone go through that? It's very difficult. How is it that when someone loses their business, how many people we know of who COVID-19 struck and their graphs that were increasing just fell towards the ground? And when they had wealth 1 second, they lost a lot of it in the next. How is it possible that someone has a loved one and they lose him due to COVID-19 or otherwise? A parent, how many people have lost their parents? How many of our friends have their parents in, for example, the hospitals right now, recovering from and struggling with COVID-19? How do I reconcile that with my Lord? Do I say that this is unfair and unjust, therefore I don't believe in God? Or do I think about it in a different way, in a different perspective? How about those people, for example, who become inflicted with the disease themselves? And trust me, I know people in our community, young people who have been afflicted. What do we do? Ayyub alayhi salam, Job gives us the opportunity to stop and reflect on this and try to think, maybe we don't know the whole puzzle. Maybe we don't know the whole picture. Maybe we don't see everything. Maybe we're just looking at things from one lens, from one perspective, from one vantage point that has not been considered before. You know, there's a lot more depth to reality. In the Islamic narrative, from the Islamic perspective, when we look at the story of Nabi Ayyub alayhi salam, we are told he is from the lineage, and his mother, for example, is from the line of Nabi Lut, from the line of Lot. And she's a descendant from there. And his wife is from the descendants in the line of Yusuf alayhi salam, Joseph. And we are told, similar to the Bible, that this is someone who is a servant of Allah, who Allah has bestowed him and given him gifts of, for example, wealth, for example, property, for example, the gift of family, a beautiful family, and the gift of health. He has everything. And the same way in the Bible, in the Quran as well, the Quran highlights this narrative that Ayyub alayhi salam, and through traditions of the Prophet, the Islamic narrative I'm sharing with you, the view of the Quran as well, the ahadith and all of them combined together. The Islamic view is, yes, Allah had given him gifts as well. And the same way that the Bible said that, for example, Job was being praised by God, the same way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knew that this was his servant who had all the gifts. At the same time, in the Quran, we're told, and in the Islamic narrative, I should say, from the view of Islam, that shaitan came forward and complained to Allah and said that this servant of yours, you've given him all the gifts, you've given him everything, you've given him wealth, you've given him family, you've given him health. But if you remove these things, if you took them away, then this person, this servant of yours, Ayyub, would no longer be grateful. This Ayyub would no longer have that trait of gratitude and thankfulness towards you. And when he looked at this idea that the Bible says with respect to Job, and the Quran al-Majid wal Furqan al-Hamid says with respect to Ayyub alayhi salam, that shaitan or Satan, as mentioned in the Bible, is someone who's coming forward and alleging to God that if you remove these gifts, if you remove all of these things, then he will no longer be thankful. The Quran says the same, that Ayyub alayhi salam, that Allah had this taken away, shaitan accused, and his wealth was taken away, so his property began to be taken away. Then at that moment, his health, his family was taken away, his children were taken away. And then on the next level, his health, he became leprosy afflicted him, and he was taken away from the town. And at that point, he still had trust, he still had belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, up until that one moment where he says and he utters to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, "Oh my Lord, I have been afflicted." It's a sort of dua. Keep this in mind as the nights of Laylatul Qadr and the end of Shahr Ramadan approaches. The way that we have a conversation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with God, is important. He began to say from the bottom of his heart that, "My Lord, I have been afflicted." What was the thing that hurt Ayyub alayhi salam the most? He said those words that the people would say to accuse him hurt the most. Did losing the wealth hurt? Certainly it hurt. Did losing your children hurt? I'm sure it hurt. Did losing your health hurt? I'm sure it hurt Ayyub alayhi salam. But he said what hurt the most was when people began to say, "Ayyub, you are suffering because you deserved it. You are suffering because you did something wrong." You know that friend I just mentioned some time ago, just a few moments ago, the one who was blind, the one who lost his siblings, who lost his sibling, who lost his parents? In our own community, some people began to say that it was perhaps some of the doings of him and his family that caused this to happen. Not everyone, but some. And that's a very, very hurtful thing to hear when you're already going through a tough time. Be very mindful that you're not the cause of someone's affliction more than it needs to be. Don't come forward and try to say that someone is being punished for what they did. Don't try forward, because we're not God. We don't know what's going on in the mind of God, so to speak. So if somebody's lost their wealth, or if somebody has, for example, lost a loved one, a child, for example, if someone's lost their health, if someone's going through any difficulty, think once, think twice, think 3 times, think over and over again before you come forward and say that God's punishing that person, because it may be that God's not punishing them. God may be rewarding them. How? Maybe not in this world, maybe in the next world. By no means am I saying do I wish ill on anyone, not at all. But it could be also preparing that person for a better time. It's not some sin that they did in the past that they're being punished for. Rather, God may be preparing them for a future date and a future time. So Ayyub alayhi salam said to Allah, "I have been afflicted. My Lord, help me. My Lord, assist me." And Allah granted him his wish and his desire. But he said those words that the people said that hurt the most. People have a way of sprinkling salt on people's wounds. Don't ever be one of those people who comes forward and takes salt and puts it on people's wounds that already hurt enough. Allah is all just. Allah is all wise. God is all wise. God is all merciful. And He knows how to deal with people. Yes, in certain instances, such as Pharaoh, such as Harun, for example, Qarun, for example, Shaddad, for example, Namrud or Nimrod. These people, they had gone past the element of arrogance, and God took care of the matter himself. But it's not for us to say. Yes, it may be for us to learn lessons, but it's not for us to play the role in the mind of God. So don't make people's lives worse than ever. I say this because I know so many brothers and even sisters write and tell emails and write in their emails that they don't feel comfortable going to the mosque. They don't feel comfortable going to the Huseiniya. They don't feel comfortable going to the Imambara sometimes. They don't feel comfortable going to the mosque. What? You don't feel comfortable going to God's house? How? Because of the words of people, because of the appraisals of people, because of the judgment of people, because of the conversations and the comments that are passed by people. It's very possible that God asks you and I on the day of judgment that my servant didn't feel comfortable and didn't come to the mosque, doesn't come to the house of worship, to my house, to God's house, because of how you were treating him, or you were part of that party that made them feel uncomfortable. Don't be one of those people. Ayyub alayhi salam in the Quran as well is given all of the gifts back from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in more than before, in double fold. He has given back his wealth, he has given back his health, he has given back his family, and he's given back his youth. And all of these elements are given back to him so that he develops and he goes and he grows even more than before. The lesson that we take away from the story of Nabi Ayyub alayhi salam is that in the good times and in the bad times, the same way in the Bible, the same way in the Islamic narrative, that Ayyub, after going through this difficulty, the realization that he had was that one should trust God in the good and in the bad. And one should be thankful to God in the good and in the bad times. Because there's a divine wisdom which we may not fully understand, which we may not fully be able to acknowledge. This is not talking about those things, those challenges that are part of our own life. These are not because of those challenges that we inflict in our own lives because of our ignorance. These are referring to things that we can't fathom, that we're not understanding. It's very possible that God is using this to help us grow. Therefore, at every moment in life, try to be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Try to be appreciative of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And try to have a grace and gratitude and thankfulness in your life. There are levels to the worship of Allah. There are levels to the obedience of Allah. There are levels to getting higher in your spirituality towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because one level is that of the sabirin, the lower level. That is the introductory level, the people who are patient in the times of difficulty. But there's a higher level. There's a level of those people who are called the shakirin, the people who are thankful and grateful to Allah in the times of difficulty. That's another level of spirituality. Therefore, in the final moments of the discussion, I want to come with some solutions to the problems and the challenges that you may face in your life. What are some solutions that you can adopt? What are some solutions to the problems and the challenges that you may adopt? One is the one I just alluded to already. The first is sabr, patience. The Quran says numerous times, وَاسْتَعِينُوا بِالصَّبْرِ وَالصَّلَاةِ, that obtain support through patience and prayer. These two things will help you in the most difficult of times. وَاسْتَعِينُوا بِالصَّبْرِ وَالصَّلَاةِ, that when you adopt patience and prayer, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will guide you and give you assistance in your life. That prayer can be, and that patience can be extremely valuable and extremely helpful. What's another tool that you and I can adopt in order to solve our problems? Well, second one is actually counsel, is actually advice. Believe me when I tell you, some of the most successful people in the world, in entrepreneurship, in business, in for example, in movies, in theater, and you name the aspect of life, some of the most successful people in the world. Let's take Warren Buffett as an example, one of the richest people in the world. He had a mentor who was very, very close to him, who he learned from, who he learned the tools of the trade that helped guide him to become who he was. And that mentorship allowed him to become who he was. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to get to that level of where he got to. He went to Columbia University, he studied and he learned under his teacher in order that he was able to learn about securities, in order so he was able to learn about investments and stocks. And when he learned through this process, he was able to become one of the wealthiest people in the world. Further than this, you look at, for example, the likes of people such as Steve Jobs in Silicon Valley. He had tremendous mentors or people who helped him. For example, Andy Grove, the founder of IBM. These people were people who mentored in times. And they were able to help these people navigate difficult times as well. Well, the same way, we should have spiritual guides, spiritual mentors, if you will. And many of our scholars have always had and remain having spiritual mentors. Who's your spiritual guide? You may have a mentor in your professional life, but who's your mentor in your relationship life? Who's your mentor in your spiritual life, in your Islamic life, for example? Do you have someone that you can go to for counsel? Believe me when I tell you, some of the most successful people in the world have mentors in every department of their life to help them spiritually, to help them relationship wise, and give them guidance in the most difficult of times. Don't neglect the need for a mentor. I tell you myself, I have spiritual mentors, or guides at least, religious mentors or guides, who help guide me when I need assistance or guidance on matters. You should as well. On top of that, try to help other people. Believe it or not, when you begin to try to help other people through their difficulties, through their problems, grace and gratitude and beauty has a way of coming into your own life. You can call it karma, as some people call it karma. You can call it, for example, whatever you want. Good faith, you can call it good stewardship, call it what you want. But when you help others and you try to make others' lives better, you will find that there is, in a way, grace and beauty will come into your own life, inshallah. Therefore, the conclusion and the takeaway from our conversation today, inshallah, is that have trust in the wisdom and the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, number one, in the good times as well as in the bad times, number two. And number three, seek solutions in your life by patience, by prayer, by seeking counsel from others, as well as also implementing in your life a scenario and an environment where you are able to actually develop this spirituality. Some of the greatest spiritual mystics, as we said on Laylatul Qadr, some of the greatest spiritual mystics in our school of thought became and developed this spirituality and this mysticism going through tremendous hardships, going through tremendous difficulties. How many difficulties Allama Tabatabai Sahibul Tafsir al-Mizan went through? From, for example, the health of his children at times, for example, to the wealth or the abject poverty he had to go through, or for example, moving from city to city. You name it, he went through tremendous difficulties, many of which he doesn't even name and you and I don't know. The same with his mentors. It may be that when you go through difficulty, God is grooming you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is grooming you and I for a better place, a better environment, and a better world. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in conclusion to allow us to have patience and prayer in the time of difficulty, to thank Him in times of good and bad, the same way the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam thanked Him in times of good and bad. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to be those people who are patient, and not only patient, those people who are thankful, not only the sabirin, but the shakirin. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless all the mu'mineen across the globe and remove and try to, for example, if there's a hardship that they are going through that is there to groom them for better times, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow them to understand the wisdom of the guidance. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow them to deal with the hardship as much as possible and grant relief as much as possible and allow them to grow. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the reappearance of the Imam of our time and allow us to be amongst his companions when he returns. Wa akhiru da'wana anil hamdu lillahi rabbil alamin.